Dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy refers to the foreign policy promoted by President William Howard Taft from 1909 to 1913. What was the philosophy behind dollar diplomacy? Well, Taft and his Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, believed that the goal of diplomacy should be improving American commercial interests both at home and overseas. They wanted to use American economic power to maintain global influence. By the time Taft became president, he was already influenced by two approaches to U.S. foreign policy. The first one became known as the open door policy. In 1899, under President McKinley, Secretary of State John Hay coined the term open door to describe an approach to keeping China open to trade. The idea being that having equal opportunity for international trade in a big country like China would protect American financial interests within the East. President Teddy Roosevelt inherited this open door philosophy and would in turn pass it along to Taft. But Roosevelt integrated another diplomatic strategy, the Roosevelt Corollary, allowing U.S. intervention in Latin American conflicts with Europe. With the Corollary in place, Roosevelt peacefully intervened in the Dominican Republic by exchanging U.S. loans for the right to choose the Dominican head of customs. This use of money as leverage is widely considered a key inspiration for dollar diplomacy. Taft justified his brand of diplomacy by arguing it substituted dollars for bullets. But how well did it actually work? Taft believed that whoever controlled the railroads of a country also controlled its economy. During his presidency, Japan and Russia controlled the railroads in China. Taft worried that the U.S. would be frozen out of China's financial markets and that it would undermine the open door policy if he didn't do something. So, using dollar diplomacy, Taft proposed a deal. Americans would purchase all of the railroads from Japan and Russia and then return them to Chinese control. But Japan and Russia said no, publicly embarrassing the Taft administration. So dollar diplomacy was generally a failure in China. But what about Central America? Taft encouraged American investment in developing Latin American countries to help them maintain stability. In 1909, dollar diplomacy was used to strip power from a corrupt president in Nicaragua by investing in a challenger who would take his place. But even with the US dollars invested in the country and a new president, Nicaragua still suffered ongoing political turmoil. Resentment from Nicaraguans led to revolution. By 1912, the US was sending in Marines instead of money. Dollars for bullets turned into dollars and bullets. U.S. forces would stay there for 13 years, as Nicaraguans grew increasingly skeptical of the United States. Dollar diplomacy failed in Nicaragua, and it failed in Mexico too. Taft encouraged U.S. investors to buy up land and resources in Mexico. By 1913, Americans had invested over $1 billion in Mexico and owned a significant percentage of the land. But the people of Mexico were angry that dictators and American investors were getting rich off their resources, while most Mexican people were poor. Regardless of Taft's intentions, dollar diplomacy both embarrassed the United States and angered our southern neighbors. It seemed other countries didn't want American involvement in their economies, but it didn't stop future administrations from doing so. Woodrow Wilson, however, upon taking office, immediately denounced dollar diplomacy and removed government support for American businesses in China and the Caribbean. Today, this policy is still criticized for the focus on financial investments as an attempt to control another nation. Of course, dollar diplomacy is not a uniquely American phenomenon. So while Taft's foreign policy was an ultimate failure, we can still feel the echo of its influence 100 years later.